There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a woman when she realizes the life she has been building was never truly hers to begin with. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of rest. It is the silence that comes after the noise, after the years of doing everything right, of checking every box, of bending yourself into shapes that other people drew for you, and then looking up one day to find that the room is empty and the applause you were promised never came. If you have ever sat alone at a table meant for two, you know exactly what that silence sounds like. If you have ever smiled through a family gathering while something inside you quietly bled, you have felt it. If you have ever been handed a version of your future that someone else designed, I dressed up in beautiful wrapping and called it love, and you almost accepted it because you were tired, because you were lonely, because no one had ever taught you that you were allowed to want something different, then this story was written for you. Because this is the story of a woman who was given 18 hours. 18 hours to choose a husband from a list that had been curated, polished, and approved by a woman whose approval had never once been given freely. 18 hours to look into the eyes of men who smiled with their mouths but not their souls, and pick one to spend her life with. 18 hours, and a clock that ticked so loudly it almost drowned out the voice inside her, the one small, stubborn voice that kept whispering that something was wrong, that something was missing. That someone was missing. What she did not know in those first few hours was that the most important person in that house was the one no one would speak about, the one they had erased, the one who turned out to be the only real thing in a family built entirely on illusion. Stay with this story, because what happens next, what she finds, what she chooses, and what it costs her will change the way you think about worth, about love, and about what it means to be truly seen. Before we go any further, this channel needs a moment to speak directly to you. Not as a narrator, not as a storyteller, but as a voice that genuinely believes you came here for a reason. If you have ever felt overlooked, you know how heavy that feeling is. Not ignored in the small ways, but truly overlooked, in the way that makes you question whether your instincts are trustworthy, whether your desires are reasonable, whether the version of love you have been holding out for is something real or something you simply invented to survive disappointment. If you have ever been handed an ultimatum disguised as an opportunity and felt the walls closing in around the edges of your own life, this channel was built for you. This is a space for women who have lived. Women who have made difficult choices and lived with the weight of them. Women who understand that love is not always soft, that sometimes it arrives after loss, after fire, after a long season of being misunderstood. If that is you, do something small right now. Press the like button. Subscribe to this channel. Not because you are being told to, but because every time you do, you are telling yourself that you deserve stories that take you seriously. And stories that do not rush you. Stories that sit with you in the pain before they walk you toward the light. And before we continue, a question. One rooted in the very heart of what is about to unfold. If the person you were meant to love had been deliberately hidden from you, erased from every record, every conversation, every photograph on the wall, would you have the courage to find them anyway? Leave your answer in the comments below, because by the end of this story, your answer may surprise you. Now, let us begin. Her name was Amada Asante. She was 31 years old, and she had learned, by that point in her life, to carry herself in a way that made the world assume she was fine. It was a skill she had developed early, not consciously, not the way you learn mathematics or how to drive, but organically, so the way all women learn to perform composure when composure is the only thing standing between them and being consumed by everyone else's discomfort. Amada had grown up in a household full of love, but also full of instruction. Her mother, Abena, was a woman of extraordinary warmth and equally extraordinary expectation. She had emigrated from Ghana to London in her 20s, had built a life there through sheer tenacity, and had raised Amada with the quiet understanding that a black woman in a world that did not always make space for her had to be twice as deliberate, twice as prepared, twice as careful. Amada had absorbed those lessons without complaint. She had studied hard, graduated with honors from a university that still sometimes felt like it had not quite made space for her either, and had built a career in international business consulting that took her across time zones and continents. By 31, she had worked in Lagos, in Singapore, in Dubai, and in Seoul. Seoul was where everything changed. But before we arrive there, it is important to understand what Amada had carried with her into that city. She had carried a quiet grief that she rarely named aloud. It was the grief of a woman who had loved once, fully, dangerously, in the way that leaves marks, and had been left. Not dramatically, not with a scene or a confrontation that at least would have given her something to hold on to. She had been left slowly, the way a tide retreats, until one morning she woke up and the man she had built her future around had simply become a stranger who lived in her apartment and slept on the far edge of her bed. His name was not important. What was important was what he said when he left. He said that she was too much, that she thought too deeply about things, that loving her felt like being asked a question he did not know how to answer. She had stood in the kitchen of their shared apartment with a mug of tea going cold in her hands and had nodded, as if she understood. As if what he had just said was reasonable, as if the correct response to being told you were too much was to make yourself smaller. She had moved out within the week. She had told her mother she was fine. She had told her colleagues she was fine. She had been, by every observable measure, entirely fine. But she had also stopped believing that love was something designed for her specifically. She had started to suspect that perhaps she was meant for something else, contribution, or achievement, purpose, and that the particular kind of love she had imagined as a younger woman was something that belonged to other people's stories. She had taken the consulting contract in Seoul because it was the right professional move. She had packed her bags and flown 14 hours east with the measured efficiency of someone who had learned to outrun stillness. Seoul was a new skyline, new problems to solve, new distance between herself and a London apartment that no longer felt like home. She had not gone there looking for anything. She had arrived with her walls carefully in place, her calendar meticulously structured, and the very quiet, very private conviction that she was not the kind of woman that extraordinary things happened to. She was wrong. But before the extraordinary arrived, there was the humiliation. There is always the humiliation first. It happened 3 months into her Seoul contract, at a dinner that she had attended because her professional position made attendance non-negotiable. The client she was consulting for, a family-owned conglomerate with interests spanning technology, real estate, and hospitality, had invited their core consultants to a formal dinner at the family estate in Seongbuk-dong, a neighborhood where the homes sat behind high walls and the kind of quiet that only comes with serious money. Amada had dressed carefully, a deep burgundy dress that she had bought in Lagos 2 years prior, fitted and elegant without being demonstrative. She had worn her hair in a natural crown, the way she always did when she needed to feel most like herself. She had prepared for the evening the way she always prepared, thoroughly, professionally, with every variable she could anticipate already mapped and managed. What she had not anticipated was Mrs. Cheon. Park Sung-ja, known to the Seoul social world as Mrs. Cheon, matriarch of the Cheon family, and the true axis around which the entire business empire turned, was a woman of 72 who had the carriage of someone who had never once doubted her right to occupy space. She was small in stature, silver-haired. She wore a pale gray hanbok embroidered with white chrysanthemums, and she moved through her own home with the calm authority of a woman who understood that she was the most powerful person in any room she entered. Amada had met her briefly at a prior board meeting. She had found her sharp, watchful, and deliberate. She had not been afraid of her. That was before dinner. The evening began without incident. The conversation was professional. The food was extraordinary, a procession of dishes that arrived with ceremony and care, each one speaking of wealth and precision. Amada sat near the center of the long table, between 2 male colleagues, and she navigated the conversation with the ease of long practice. It was after the third course that Mrs. Cheon turned her attention to Amada in a way that the room immediately noticed. "Miss Asante," she said, setting down her chopsticks with the deliberateness of a woman making a decision rather than simply resting her hands. "You are unmarried." It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that carries the weight of a verdict. Amada looked up. She kept her face composed. "I am," she said. "And your age?" Mrs. Cheon asked. The table had gone quieter than it should have, not silent. Conversation still murmured at its edges, but the people nearby had shifted in the particular way people do when they sense something is about to happen and they are not sure whether to pretend they cannot hear. 31, Amada said. Mrs. Cheon made a sound, not cruel precisely, but considered, the sound of a woman cataloging information and finding the data somewhat wanting. "In Korea," she said, "we would say you are approaching a difficult age for marriage." Amada held her gaze. Something moved beneath her composure, not quite anger, not quite hurt, but something that drew on reserves of both. "I was not aware there was a universally difficult age," she said, and she kept her voice level, because she had spent 31 years learning how to keep her voice level. Mrs. Cheon almost smiled. "Perhaps not universally," she said, "but practically." There was a beat of silence. Then one of the male colleagues near Amada laughed, the particular laugh of a man who is uncomfortable and has reached for humor instead of accountability. Another person at the table made a small observation about the wine. The moment was papered over with social efficiency, and dinner continued. But Amada sat with it. She sat with it through the remainder of the meal. She sat with it through the dessert course, through the polite conversations that followed, through the careful goodbyes at the door of the estate. She sat with it in the car that drove her back to her hotel, and she sat with it in her room, at the window, looking out at a city of extraordinary light. She had been diminished in public, quietly, precisely, by a woman who had likely done it dozens of times before to dozens of different women and had never once felt the need to apologize for it. And what she felt, sitting there at that window, was not merely the sting of the moment, it was the accumulated weight of every moment like it. Every room where she had been made to feel that her value was conditional, every relationship where her worth had been tied to her availability, her compliance, her willingness to be what someone else needed her to be. She thought about going home. She thought about calling her mother, who would say the right things, but who would also, gently and lovingly, remind her that some things in life required patience and strategy, and not every slight was worth the energy of a response. She did not call her mother. Instead, she sat with the feeling until it transformed, until the hurt became something harder and cleaner, until what she felt was not shame, which was what Mrs. Cheon had intended, but clarity. She was not going to let that woman diminish her. She was also not done with the Cheon family, because something had happened over dinner, something beneath the humiliation, something she had almost missed in the distraction of managing her own composure, that was pulling at her attention now, quietly and insistently. It was a name that had been spoken once at the far end of the table by one of the younger staff, spoken softly, quickly, and almost immediately met with a sharp look from one of Mrs. Cheon's sons that silenced the speaker instantly. Junho, a name that had made Mrs. Cheon's expression change, just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Amada to notice. She turned the name over in her mind like a stone found on an unexpected path. She did not yet know what it meant. She did not yet know why it mattered. But something inside her, the same instinct that made her good at her work, the same instinct she had learned to trust over 31 years of navigating rooms that were not always designed with her in mind, told her to pay attention. But before we talk about what happened next, and what happened next is the part of this story that changes everything. Let us be honest about something. Most of us have been in that room. Most of us have sat at that table and felt that specific cold settle over us, the chill of being evaluated and found incomplete by someone whose opinion we never asked for and never should have needed. Most of us have smiled through it, and most of us have gone home and sat with a feeling we could not quite name, not quite anger, not quite sadness, something that lived in the space between the two, something that asked us quietly whether we were going to keep accepting this, whether this was simply the cost of living in a world that had not yet fully made room for us, or whether there was another path. What Amada did next was not something she planned. It was something she felt her way toward, one question at a time, one piece of truth at a time, until she was standing in front of something that the Cheon family had spent years trying to bury, and the person she found there, the one they had erased, was not what she expected. He was more. Stay with us. 2 days after the dinner, Mrs. Cheon summoned her. Not requested, not invited. Summoned, which was its own statement, delivered through a formal message passed to Amada via the family's head of corporate relations, who delivered it with the careful neutrality of a person conveying a directive they had not been asked to explain. Amada might have declined. She thought about it. She sat with her tea in the morning light of her hotel room and considered what declining would cost her professionally and what accepting would cost her personally, and ultimately concluded that curiosity was a more compelling force than caution. And she went to the Cheon estate. Mrs. Cheon received her in a sitting room that communicated its owner's nature through every detail, the restraint of the furniture, the deliberateness of the single flower arrangement on a lacquered table, the way the light entered the room as if by permission. Mrs. Cheon herself sat across from Amada in a high-backed chair and looked at her with the expression of a woman who had already made a decision and was now simply waiting to announce it. "I have been watching you," Mrs. Cheon said, without preamble. "You are intelligent, composed, you handle pressure without performance. These are qualities I value." Amada held her hands still in her lap. "Thank you," she said. "I am also aware," Mrs. Cheon continued, "of the impracticality of your current situation. A woman of your caliber, unmarried at 31, working in a city that is not her own. There is a solution to this." She paused, the pause of someone accustomed to having their pauses felt. "I have 3 sons who are unmarried. I am proposing that you spend time with them over the next 18 hours. At the end of that period, if you find one of them suitable, I will facilitate an arrangement, one that would be mutually advantageous." Amada looked at her for a long moment. "You are asking me to choose a husband," she said, "in 18 hours. "I am offering you an opportunity," Mrs. Cheon said. "There is a difference." There was a great deal Amada could have said in that moment. A great deal she could have pointed out about the assumptions embedded in the proposal, about the reduction of her personhood to a scheduling problem, about the breathtaking arrogance of a woman who believed that love could be administered like a business arrangement, about the fact that the man she chose from this curated list would enter her life already belonging to his mother more than he would ever belong to himself. She said none of this. Instead, she said, "Tell me about your sons." And Mrs. Cheon told her. She spoke about them with the precision of a woman presenting assets in a portfolio. Jae-won, the eldest, who ran the family's technology division. Soo-hyun, the second, who managed their real estate holdings. Do-hyun, the youngest, who had studied in the United States and was being groomed for international expansion. She spoke about their educations, their achievements, their manner, their temperament. She spoke about 3 sons. Amada listened carefully. She asked the right questions at the right moments. She kept her face neutral and her attention sharp, and she thought about the name she had heard at the dinner table, the name that had made Mrs. Cheon's expression flicker, Junho. She did not ask about him. Not yet. Instead, she said, "I'll meet them." The 3 sons arrived in sequence, as if choreographed, which, she would later understand, they had been. Jae-won was first. 42, impeccably dressed, with the careful manner of a man who had learned long ago that presenting the right surface was more important than revealing what lay beneath it. He was not unkind. He was, in fact, quite charming, the kind of charm that is so polished it reflects rather than reveals, so that by the end of an hour in his company, Amada realized she knew nothing real about him at all. He told her about his work. his vision for the company's digital infrastructure. He asked her questions about her consulting projects that were professionally astute but personally evasive, the questions of a man gathering information rather than expressing interest. When she told him about the city she had grown up in, about London in winter, about the particular smell of her mother's kitchen on a Sunday morning, something moved behind his eyes. Not connection, but calculation, as if he were filing the information away rather than receiving it. She thanked him for his time, and he bowed and left, and she sat for a moment in the room they had been given and thought, there is nothing wrong with this man, and there is nothing real about him either. Soo-hyun was different in style, but identical in substance. He was warmer in affect. He laughed easily, complimented her naturally, touched the arm of his chair in the way of a man who was comfortable with intimacy, but the warmth had the quality of performance rather than personality. It was delivered rather than felt. He spoke about travel, about art, about a trip he had taken to Cape Town 3 years prior that he described with the pleasant superficiality of someone recounting a hotel rather than a place. When Amada spoke about her own travels, about the particular red of a Ghanaian sunset, about the way Accra smelled after rain, about the market in Seoul's Namdaemun, where she had once spent an entire afternoon and felt briefly, unexpectedly, at home, he listened with his face but not his body. She could see him waiting for her to finish. He left. She remained. The afternoon light shifted, and Doyeon came last. He was the youngest, 34, educated in Boston, fluent in the ease of someone who had spent years learning to move between cultures. He was the most naturally likable of the three. He smiled at her in a way that reached his eyes, asked her questions that were genuinely curious rather than performative, and there were moments, small ones, where she thought, perhaps this one. But then he said something. He said it lightly, in the way people say the things that reveal the most about them when they think the conversation has relaxed enough for revelation. He said, "My mother is difficult, but she is usually right. I've found it's easier to trust her judgment on things." And Amada looked at him, at his easy smile, at his borrowed confidence, and at the comfortable resignation of a man who had traded his own judgment for the peace of his mother's approval, and thought, no. This was not cowardice. This was a lifetime of it. This was a man shaped a lifetime of it. This was a man shaped around an absence of self. She thanked him. She watched him leave. And then she was alone in a room in the Cheon estate, with 12 hours remaining on the clock Mrs. Cheon had given her, and the absolute certainty that none of the men she had just met was the answer to any question worth asking. She sat with that certainty for a long moment. Then she got up, and she started asking questions. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge something about this moment, about the particular kind of courage it takes to do what Amada did next. It is easy from the outside to say, she should have simply left. She should have walked out of the estate, returned to her hotel, and told Mrs. Cheon and her portfolio of sons that she was not a problem to be solved or an asset to be acquired, and perhaps she should have. But there is something else at work in a moment like this. There is the pull of the thing you cannot explain, the quiet, persistent feeling that you are standing at the edge of something important, and that walking away would be the safer choice, but not the true one. There is the voice that does not always use words, that sometimes speaks only in the language of instinct and insistence, that tells you, stay, look, there is something here you have not yet found. Amada had spent 31 years learning to override that voice when it was inconvenient. This time she listened to it. If this story is moving you, if something in it is touching a place inside you that needed to be touched, take a moment now to hit the like button. Share it with a friend who needs it. You will know exactly who she is. And stay with us, because the next part of this story is where everything breaks open. She began with the staff, not in any dramatic sense. She was a consultant. She was accustomed to gathering information from the people who actually moved a house rather than the people who owned it. She spoke to the woman who brought her tea in the afternoon and asked, with the natural curiosity she had always been able to deploy without appearing suspicious, about the family, about the estate, about how long she had worked there. The woman, Mireille, perhaps 50, and with the quiet economy of movement that comes from decades of professional precision, answered politely, carefully, with the measured generosity of someone who had learned exactly how much information to offer and where the line was. But she paused once, when Amada asked how many children Mrs. Cheon had. Just a pause, a fraction of a second, the kind that most people would miss. Amada did not miss it. 3 sons, Mireille said. Jaewon, Soohyun, and Doyun. 3, Amada repeated, her tone conversational, her attention absolute. Yes, Mireille said and moved toward the door. Mireille, Amada said, and something in her voice, not pressure, not threat, but a kind of quiet gravity, made the woman turn back. I heard a name at dinner, Junho. Who is Junho? Mireille's face did not change. That itself was an answer. I'm not sure, she said, and left. Amada sat with the name again. Then she went looking. The estate had a library, formal, museum quiet, its shelves arranged with the care of a family that understood that books communicated status as effectively as any other possession. Amada spent 20 minutes there, not reading, but looking. At family portraits on the wall, at the photographs arranged on a sideboard, decades of Cheon family history, organized with the precision of a woman who understood narrative and had chosen the narrative she wanted displayed. The photographs told a story. Mrs. Cheon, younger, with her husband, now deceased. 4 children, then 3, then 2, then 1. A progression that was not the natural reduction of children growing up and leaving the frame, but something more deliberate, a subtraction. There were 4 children in the oldest photographs. The 4th child disappeared from the record around what appeared to be his early teenage years. A boy, dark-haired, thinner than his brothers, with a quality in his face, even in photographs, even at that age, that the others did not have. Something that looked from this distance like honesty. Amada looked at those photographs for a long time. Then she asked, because she was always going to ask, and because the asking was the only honest thing left in a house full of careful performance, where was the 4th child? She found the answer not in the estate, but outside it. One of the younger gardeners, a man in his mid-20s who spoke enough English to converse and who had not yet developed the protective opacity of longer service, told her that when she walked past him in the garden in the late afternoon and asked with the simple directness of someone who had stopped pretending the question was casual, the 4th son. His name is Junho. Where is he? The young man looked at her. He looked at the house. He looked back at her. Then he told her about a neighborhood 20 minutes away by car, about a small workshop, about a man who worked with his hands and did not attend family events and had not been mentioned in this house in nearly a decade. He told her because she had asked him directly, person to person, with the kind of respect that made him feel that his knowledge was worth something. He told her because sometimes truth simply needs to be invited. Amada returned to her room. She sat with what she now knew, which was still very little, but was more than anyone in the Cheon estate had intended for her to know, and she thought about what it would cost her to leave the estate tonight, to follow the address the gardener had given her, to seek out a man that a powerful woman had gone to significant lengths to erase. She thought about what it would cost her not to. She called a car. The workshop was on a narrow street in a neighborhood that had the comfortable, lived-in quality of a place that had not yet been consumed by development. Small restaurants with handwritten menus, a dry cleaning shop, a hardware store, the kind of street that still remembered itself. The workshop itself was a converted storefront. Through the window, she could see the warm light of a work lamp, the clean geometry of woodworking tools, and a man bent over a workbench with the focused concentration of someone engaged in something he cared about deeply. She stood outside for a longer moment than she had intended. Not from fear, exactly, from the strange gravity of the moment, the sense that the next few minutes would divide her life into before and after, and that she needed to be fully present for the crossing. Then she knocked. He looked up. He came to the door. He opened it and looked at her with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to unexpected visitors, not suspicious exactly, but cautious in the way that people become cautious when life has taught them that unexpected things often cost something. He was 36. He was not tall in the way his brothers were tall. There was nothing performed about his height. And he had the hands of someone who worked with them daily, and the eyes of someone who had thought through most of what the world had offered him, and arrived at a set of conclusions that he held quietly and did not need to defend. His name was Cheon Junho, and he looked at Amada Asante on the doorstep of his workshop with an expression that shifted, in the space of a few seconds, from caution to curiosity, to something she could not yet name, but that felt, unexpectedly, impossibly, against every reasonable forecast, like recognition. "You came from my mother's house," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He studied her for another moment. Then he stepped back from the door in a gesture that was not quite an invitation, but was not a refusal either. It was the gesture of a man who had learned to leave space for other people to make their own choices. She stepped inside. They talked for 3 hours. She had not planned to talk for 3 hours. She had planned to ask her questions, gather her information, understand what the family had hidden and why, and return to the estate with whatever clarity that understanding gave her. But Junho did not speak in the way she had been taught to expect people to speak, not in the way of the 3 men she had met that day, who spoke to present themselves. He spoke to think. He spoke to understand. And when she spoke, really spoke. Not the surface version she had offered to Jaewon and Soo-hyun and Do-hyun, but the actual version. The one with edges and uncertainty and the particular texture of a life that had been lived rather than managed. He listened in the way that very few people have ever learned to listen. He listened with his whole body still, with his eyes on hers, with the quality of attention that makes a person feel that what they are saying is the most important thing being said anywhere in the world at this particular moment. She told him about London, about her mother, about the ex-boyfriend who had said she was too much, and how she had nodded as if that were a reasonable thing to say to a person. She did not know why she was telling him this. She had not told anyone this, not the full version of it, not with the weight she had always carried it. But it came out of her, quietly and without drama, as if the presence of a truly attentive listener had simply made it possible. He listened. He did not rush to reassure her. He did not offer the quick comfort that would have let him off the hook of really receiving what she was saying. He sat with it for a moment, the way a person sits with something that matters. Then he said, "I think the people who tell us we are too much are usually people who have not yet decided to be enough." She looked at him. He was not looking at her with romantic interest in the way she might have expected. There was no performance in it, no angle. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a truth they have arrived at from a different direction and are surprised to find confirmed. She asked him about the family. He told her, quietly, without bitterness, which was what surprised her most. She had expected bitterness. She had expected from a man who had been erased from a family's official story, at least the residue of old anger. But what she found instead was something more complex and more resolved. The understanding of a person who has spent time, real time, years of it, making sense of painful things. He told her that he had been removed from the family's public life because he had refused at 17 to lie. There had been a business arrangement, his father's in his final years, that had involved people being misled and money being moved in ways that were not clean. Junho had been the only one of the 4 children who had understood what was happening and who had refused to participate in the silence that followed. His mother had interpreted this as disloyalty. His brothers, younger and more frightened, but had followed their mother's lead. His father had died. The arrangement had been buried. Junho had been buried with it. He had not fought it. He had not tried to reclaim his place in a family that had made clear his place was conditional. He had simply built a different life. Smaller, quieter, truer. A workshop. Wood, which he described with the understated love of a person describing the thing that had saved them. the work of making things with his hands that had integrity, that were what they appeared to be, that did not pretend to be something other than what they were. Amada listened to all of this, and she thought, "This is the most honest person I have encountered in this city, in perhaps a very long time." She thought something else too, something she was not quite ready to name, something that had begun, in the warmth of this small workshop, to move in the direction of the feeling she had told herself she was no longer waiting for. She went back to the estate at midnight. She sat in her room with the weight of what she now knew and the lightness, paradoxically, of having known it. She had 6 hours left on Mrs. Cheon's clock. She had expected Mrs. Cheon to be composed when she announced her choice. She had not accounted for the particular quality of Mrs. Cheon's composure when something genuinely surprised her, which was less composure and more the surface tension of a woman holding something back by force of will alone. Amada stood in the formal sitting room at 7 in the morning and said simply and without preamble, "I've met all 4 of your sons." The room went very quiet. Mrs. Cheon's face did not change, but something shifted behind it. "I have 3 sons," she said. "You have 4, Amada said. There was a long silence. Mrs. Cheon's eldest, Jae-won, was in the room. He had arrived for what he had clearly expected to be a routine announcement. He was standing near the window, and his face was doing something complicated, something that involved both surprise and the instinct to suppress it. "Junho is irrelevant to this conversation," Mrs. Cheon said. "He is the most relevant part of it," Amada said. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands still. She had rehearsed none of this, but she had spent 31 years learning how to hold herself when the ground was uncertain. "He is the person in this family most worth knowing. He is also the person you have worked hardest to make sure I would not know." "You do not understand our family," Mrs. Cheon said, and now there was something in her voice that was not quite anger. It was older than anger, harder than anger, the voice of a woman who has organized reality around a particular story for so long that any challenge to the story feels like a challenge to reality itself. "You are right," Amada said. "I do not understand your family, but I understand honesty, and I understand what it costs a family when they choose their image over their truth." She had not expected what happened next. Jae-won, the eldest, the composed one, the one with the polished surface and the careful charm, made a sound, not quite a word. He turned from the window, and for a moment his face was entirely unguarded, and what was on it was not anger. It was something much older, something that had been pressed down under the weight of decades of performance. It was grief. He left the room without speaking. Soo-hyun, who had arrived somewhere during Amada's speech without her noticing, stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides. Do-hyun was not present. The staff, wherever they were, had made themselves appropriately invisible. Mrs. Cheon and Amada looked at each other across a room full of expensive furniture and the wreckage of a carefully maintained story. "You would choose him," Mrs. Cheon said, and it was not a question. It was an accounting. It was a woman doing the arithmetic of consequences. "I would choose honesty," Amada said, which, in this family, happens to be the same thing. There was a very long silence. Then Mrs. and Cheon said, "You should know what you are walking into." "I do," Amada said. "You cannot know," Mrs. Cheon said, and her voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but older. The voice of someone speaking from a place they had not visited in a long time. "He is not easy. He has never made anything easy. He refused." She stopped, started again. "He was always the most like his father, not in the ways that mattered to me, in the ways I could not manage." Amada looked at her. "The ways that mattered to him," she said. Mrs. Cheon was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "You are not what I expected." "No," Amada said. "I imagine I am not." The weeks that followed were not simple. She had known they would not be. Choosing truth over comfort is rarely the beginning of a smooth road. it is more often the beginning of a necessary one. The Cheon family did not collapse in the way dramatic stories might suggest. Families rarely do. They are more resilient than that and more complicated, held together not only by love and loyalty, but by the weight of shared history and the mutual understanding that falling apart is expensive in ways that go beyond money. But things shifted, slowly, with the organic difficulty of things shifting in real life. Jaewon came to find Amada 3 days later, with the careful approach of a man who had spent 3 days deciding whether he had the courage to do what he was doing. He asked her, with the stiff formality of someone who rarely asked for anything, how she had known to look for Junho. She told him about the names spoken at dinner, the pause in the maid's face, the photographs in the library. He listened with the expression of a man hearing the explanation for something he had lived inside for so long, he had stopped seeing it. He said, "I knew it was wrong. What happened to him? I have always known." She said nothing. He said, "I did not have the courage your version of him seems to require." She said, "You still could." He looked at her. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man making a decision rather than an acknowledgement. Then he left. She did not know, at that moment, what he would do with the decision. She did not know whether the Cheon family would find its way to something more honest, whether Mrs. Cheon would ever be capable of the particular kind of love that makes space for the children it finds difficult, whether the relationship between brothers who had spent a decade on different sides of a wall their mother had built could ever fully recover. But she had learned by 31 that you do not always get to see the end of the story. Sometimes you simply add your truth to the air of a place, and you trust that truth to do its own work. What she did know was this: Junho had come to the estate the morning after her confrontation with his mother, at her request. He had come with the careful composure of a man who had learned to protect himself from hope, who had been burned by this house before and was not ready to be burned again. He had stood in the driveway and looked at her, and she had looked back at him, and between them was everything that had been said in the workshop and everything that had not yet been said, and the particular. A peculiar sensation of two people standing at the beginning of something that neither of them had planned for. "You chose me," he said. "I chose the truth," she said. "You happened to be it." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled. Not the polished smile of his brothers, not the performed warmth of men who had learned that smiling was a strategy. It was the smile of a man who was genuinely surprised by joy, and who had learned enough about the fragility of good things to receive it carefully. "That might be the most terrifying thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. "Good," she said. "I find that honesty tends to be." They did not rush anything. That is important to understand. This is not a story about love arriving at speed, and about two people meeting in extraordinary circumstances and immediately combusting into something cinematic and total. This is a story about the slower, realer thing, the kind of connection that builds itself out of repeated choice, out of the decision, made again and again in small moments, to be honest rather than strategic. Amada's consulting contract continued through the rest of that year. She worked her hours, she did her work, she had dinner with Junho twice a week in the beginning, in small restaurants in the neighborhood near his workshop, places where the food was ordinary and the light was warm and no one was performing anything for anyone. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about the wood, she told him about the consulting. And he told her about his father. Not with the narrative tidiness of a story that had already been made sense of, but with the unfinished quality of grief that was still, at its edges, being metabolized. She told him about London, about her mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, about the ex-boyfriend and the too much, which she could now tell with the slight distance of someone who has processed a thing enough to hold it without it holding her. He listened. She listened. They made the small, ordinary, irreplaceable discoveries of two people genuinely paying attention to each other. He told her once, it was a winter evening, the city outside cold and bright, that he had stopped expecting to be chosen, not bitterly, not as an accusation toward the world, simply as a fact about his life that he had arranged himself around, not the way you arrange a room when one wall is not available. She had looked at him across the table and said, "You should unarrange that." He laughed, a real laugh. She had found over the months that she was collecting his real laughs the way you collect things that are rare and irreplaceable. "Easier said," he said. "Harder done," she agreed, "but worth it." She extended her contract. She told her mother about him on a Sunday call. Her mother, who was quiet for a moment when she heard the circumstances of the introduction, and then said, with the dry accuracy that had always been one of her great gifts, "You chose the one they hid. Of course you did." "Of course I did," Amada said. Her mother laughed. Then she said more softly, "Tell me about him." And Amada did. She told her about the workshop and the wood and the way he listened and the real laugh and the 17-year-old boy who had refused to lie and had paid for it in decades of erasure. She told her about his hands and his eyes and the careful way he received good things, as if he had not entirely given up the habit of expecting them to be taken away. Her mother listened to all of it. Then she said, "He sounds like a man who learned his worth from the inside out. Those are the ones who keep it." Amada sat with that for a long time after the call ended. Mrs. Cheon did not transform overnight. That too is important to say because the stories that comfort us most are often the ones that offer transformation as a clean event, a revelation, a moment of grace, and then a changed person. But real transformation is slower and more ambiguous than that. It happens in increments. It is not always visible. Sometimes the most you can say is that the distance between two people has shortened by degrees that are small enough to measure only in retrospect. Mrs. Cheon called Amada 4 months after the confrontation in the sitting room and asked to have tea. Amada went. She went because she was not afraid of the woman, and because she understood, from the outside now, with the clarity of distance, that what Mrs. Cheon had built, the control and the erasures and the carefully managed story, had not come from cruelty. It had come from fear. The particular fear of a woman who had understood, early and painfully, that the world offered very little softness to someone in her position, and who had responded by deciding that she would be harder than the world that frightened her. This did not excuse what she had done. It did not undo the decade that Junho had spent outside the frame of his own family. It did not give back the years. But it was true, and Amada had always been willing to hold the truth, even the uncomfortable kind. They had tea. Mrs. Cheon spoke first, which surprised Amada. She had expected to be made to wait for it, to be made to earn the opening. Mrs. Cheon said, "He called me." Amada waited. "Junho, he called me last week." She paused. Her hands around her teacup were entirely still. "We spoke for 40 minutes. It was the first time we had spoken at length in 9 years. She did not say what they had spoken about. Amada did not ask. Some things are private enough that asking is its own kind of trespass. Instead, Amada said, "How was it?" Mrs. Cheon was quiet for a long moment. "Difficult," she said, and then, after another pause, "Necessary." Amada looked at her, this woman of 72 who had organized a family around her own fear and called it love, and felt something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite understanding, but something that lived in the territory between them. Something that acknowledged the human being inside the power without excusing what the power had done. "He is going to be all right," Amada said. "He has always been going to be all right." Mrs. Cheon looked at her. Something moved in her face. Something that was very close to the expression of a woman who wants to cry and has spent 70 years ensuring she never does. I know," she said. "That was always the thing about him. He was always going to be all right. It was the rest of us I was worried about." They finished their tea. The distance between them did not disappear, but it shortened by degrees that were small and real. Amada stayed in Seoul. This surprised some people. It did not surprise her mother, who had always understood that her daughter went where her truth led her, and that this was not a flaw but the deepest expression of who she was. It did not surprise Junho, who had watched her operate for months and understood without needing to be told that the woman he was coming to love did not make decisions by accident. She built a practice there, not as a consultant passing through, but as someone with roots, with a professional community, with the particular belonging that comes from committing to a place. She kept her London ties. She flew back twice a year to sit in her mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings and eat jollof rice and be reminded of the specific texture of being known by someone who has known you your whole life. She and Junho built something slowly, with intention, with the care of two people who had both, at different points and in different ways, been careless with themselves and had learned the cost of it. He made her a small table once, walnut with clean lines and the kind of quiet beauty that is not designed to announce itself. He set it in the corner of her apartment where the morning light was best. He said nothing about it. He did not need to. She understood. She had a photograph of her grandmother on that table, Akosua Asante, who had lived 91 years in the Volta region of Ghana and whose expression in every photograph ever taken of her was one of amused and unshakable dignity. It felt right, somehow, that the table Junho had made with his hands should hold her grandmother's face, that the story of an Asante woman choosing truth in a Cheon house should find its way back in small details to the women who had come before and made that choice possible. There is something this story wants to say to you now, directly, before it closes. It wants to say this: you are allowed to question the list they hand you. You are allowed to look past the curated presentation, the polished suns, the approved choices, the options that represent what everyone else has decided is good enough for you, and ask whether there is something or someone and that the official story has been careful not to mention, because there usually is. The things that are hidden from you are often hidden for a reason, and that reason is rarely your protection. It is more often the protection of a story that cannot survive your honesty. The sun they said didn't exist turned out to be the only real thing in a house built on illusion. He was the one who had refused to lie, who had paid with years of erasure, who had built from the ruins of his erasure a life of such integrity that it was the most stable thing in a family full of performed stability. Amada did not choose him because he was perfect. She chose him because he was true. She chose him because the voice inside her, the one she had spent years learning to quiet, and the one that asked inconvenient questions and refused to be satisfied with curated answers, recognized something in him that it recognized in itself. She chose him because he had also, once, refused to lie, and that refusal had cost them both. But it had also, in ways that neither of them could have planned or predicted, made it possible for them to find each other, made it possible for them to recognize each other. Truth tends to recognize itself across a room. If you have stayed with this story until now, then something in it spoke to you. Perhaps you recognize the dinner table moment, the public diminishment, the performance of composure, the quiet grief of a woman holding herself together in a room that is not fully hers. Perhaps you recognize the curated list, the sense of being offered options that were designed by someone else for reasons that had nothing to do with your actual well-being. Perhaps you recognized the moment of choosing, the terrifying, clarifying moment when you stand at the edge of what is expected and step, deliberately, toward what is true. Perhaps you recognized Junho, not a specific person, but the quality of a person. The person in your life, or in your memory, or in your future, who carries their worth quietly and does not perform it, who listens with their whole self, whose honesty has cost them something, whose integrity is not the absence of struggle, but the residue of it. If any of that is you, if you have ever been made to feel that you are too much or too complicated, or that the love you are looking for is somehow outside the realistic expectations for a woman your age, in your circumstances, with your particular and irreducible self, then this story is your story too. Because the lesson of Amada and Junho is not that love solves everything. It is not that the right person erases the difficulty of being alive. It is that when two people who have both learned to be honest with themselves find each other, the love they build has a foundation that is actually capable of bearing weight. It is that authenticity, the choice to be real rather than performed, to question rather than comply, to look past the curated version of reality toward the thing that the curated version is designed to hide, is not a romantic quality. It is a survival quality. It is the quality that makes a life and a love so that you do not have to perform. Choose the one they said didn't exist, not because the invisible ones are always right, but because the fact of their invisibility often means that something true about them could not survive the management of a family's story. Be the woman who knocked on that door. Be the woman who stayed in the workshop for 3 hours and told the truth about herself to a man who listened with his whole body still. Be the woman who walked into a powerful woman's sitting room and said simply and without drama, "I have met all 4 of your sons. You already have the courage. It has been there all along, underneath everything they asked you to prioritize over it. Before you go, if this story reached something in you, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share it with a woman in your life who needs to be reminded that she is allowed to ask for the thing that is not on the list. Your support keeps these stories coming, and every share means another woman finds her way here. Leave a comment below. Tell us, have you ever chosen the thing that wasn't presented to you? Have you ever followed the name that nobody mentioned, the path that nobody recommended, the truth that a room full of people was conspiring to keep quiet? We want to hear from you. This community was built for your voice, and if you are ready for another story, one that will sit with you the same way this one has, our next video is waiting for you. It is about a woman who was told that the most important choice of her life had already been made for her. She made a different one. Stay with us. We are not done telling the stories that matter.